thank you all very much for being here. My name is Ed Behrens. I'm the editor of Apollo magazine, and I am joined today by Louise Mirror, the director and president of the New York Historical Society, which, as Simone mentioned, is the oldest museum in New York, founded in 1804. I think we're just going to dive straight in, if that's okay. So I'm very intrigued by the New York Historical Society because, as with so many museums, it is a collection of different collections. But there's something quite disparate about many of the collections that are within the New York Historical Society. So how does your museum tell a coherent story about its entirety of collection?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ed, for inviting me to join you in conversation today, and thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. It's a wonderful question to ask. We are indeed, as I always say, a collection of collections, and that goes back to our founding in 1804 by 10 men, visionary. They had all lived through the American Revolution. And unlike many people who find themselves in the midst of a very tumultuous historical period, they had the consciousness to say, this is the time to collect and preserve. Very, very few people can stop and take stock in, imagine New York was burned to the ground during the Revolution, the American Revolution, not once, but twice. The city was occupied during virtually the entire revolution. So, here were 10 men, 11 men in the midst of a city that no one really at that point had any idea would become the New York City that it is today. I mean, it looked, certainly at the beginning of the American Revolution when the Declaration of Independence was read out in Philadelphia in 1776. It looked as though Philadelphia or Boston would be the main event. No one could have imagined that New York was going to be the city it is today. So these 11 visionary men began to collect and preserve. And so just as you say, our collections grew in a somewhat haphazard way, both on the museum side and on the library side. And the disparateness comes from the fact that pretty soon New Yorkers began to travel far and wide, and they started bringing things back with them, like Egyptian mummies and papyruses and all sorts of things. At a certain moment in time, really, at the turn of probably around 1900, the early 1900s, there was a decision taken to, start really thinking about what collections belonged and what collections really had to be distributed among other museums. For about 70 years, there was no other museum in New York. So we gave our costume collection to the Brooklyn Museum, for example, and so on and so forth. But indeed, we still do have collections that can tell, I say, virtually any story.
Yes.
So how do we bring this all together to weave really a narrative that is very rich, but nevertheless coherent? And that is what we say. We're American history through the lens of New York. So our collections, there is always a reason for our collections to be at the New York Historical Society, whether it's because it's George Washington, the armchair that George Washington sat in when he was inaugurated, the nation's first president. New York was the nation's first capital. Or Lafayette's gloves that he wore when he returned to New York on a victory tour in 1824. They were French, but they belong in our collection because he wore them. Actually, he wore them to New York Historical Society when he was feted that year. So that is really, how we see our collections, and there is always some common thread that speaks to both the history of the nation and the history of the city.
Yes. I think we might get on to the history aspect of life a little further down the line, because I think that's tricky. But before we get onto that, How are you able to talk a little bit about how you see the landscape of New York museums now, and by extension of how you fit in with it?
Yes, absolutely. Museums are, many people come to New York, they come from Broadway or they come from museums. Obviously other things as well, but those are the main drivers of tourism in New York. And clearly, the museum culture in New York, which has been around for centuries, has been a staple of culture in the city and how people experience things. And very sadly, during COVID, when people couldn't visit museums, that culture very much quieted. But we're back. We're all back. Last year, our visitation was almost as high as the highest visitation we've had, which was the year we mounted Harry Potter and the History of Magic, an exhibition, by the way, from the British Library, which we augmented with our own collections. So I think museums, once again, are driving tourism, driving local visitation, and once again are seen as strong and important. Museums have also become implicated in politics and really questions around how we represent ourselves. I mean, in our case, clearly how we represent ourselves as Americans. In the case of other museums, and we know all the debates and discussions about repatriation of collections, how we represent other cultures. And so museums, I think for many years were sort of able to stand on the sidelines. Structurally, our own architecture originally, until we renovated, originally reflected the sense that museums were guardians of treasures, and those treasures had to be very carefully kept. But today, because we're so outwardly focused, I think inevitably museums had to wade in to really important but sometimes controversial debates around politics and culture.
Yes. Do you think that there are certain museums that shouldn't get involved in those debates? Do you think that there are certain debates that no museum should be involved in at all?
Well, I have my own views, which I can't, really foist onto any other institutions. I feel that museums are places that do things, and our museum in particular, if we want to get involved in a debate or a discussion or take a position or make a statement, in my view, we must do it through something that relates to us as a museum. So, if we want to make a statement about whatever the topic is, we need to either have a public program, we have very vibrant evening public program series, or do an exhibition on the topic. That is the language that museums, in my opinion, need to speak. I think otherwise it's just empty rhetoric. I mean, why does a museum have any stature greater than anyone else who's able to make a statement? Yes. And it may be just a very narrow and particular point of view, but we follow it at our institution.
Okay, so to move on to safer territory for a moment, can we just talk, I don't know how many people here know about specifically the collection of the New York Historical Society. I'd love to talk about some of the highlights that you have. For example, an absolutely extraordinary collection of Hudson colorists, Audubon's birds, and then, of course, the sort of internationally renowned collection of Tiffany lamps. Could you tell us a little bit about some of your preferred highlights, also how they fit together and what they say about New York? Small question.
I love all of those collections. They're wonderful. Our Hudson River School collection, I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about Hudson River School because it was indeed a school, but the landscapes depicted in those paintings, which are landscape paintings, range from the South Pacific to the far west of the United States to the Hudson River. So there are beautiful, beautiful landscapes painted by American artists in the mid-19th century. And the collection came to us as a result of a collecting by a New Yorker called Luman Reed. Luman Reed was, unlike many of the original founders of museums like Metropolitan Museum of Art, who believed that New York could only be a global city were it to show off European art, because that was the standard of the 19th century. Luman Reed thought, well, he's going to make a market for American art. He's going to create a taste for American art. He's going to introduce people to American art. And that is exactly what he did. And subsequent to his amassing his collection, it was gifted to us. And that's how we have those wonderful paintings. I mean, some of them are, well, probably the most important of the Hudson River School artists' work in our collection is Thomas Cole's Course of Empire. And it isn't exactly a landscape, and it doesn't reflect any real place that you would encounter, although it resonates with ancient Rome, for example. So it is a bit of an unusual feature. It is very, very popular these days. It's always been very popular, but it's particularly popular these days as people muse whether we're about to have a disastrous fall, like as in the Roman Empire.
So, I mean, it's interesting you say they're popular. These works are currently in an exhibition which is recontextualizing many of the works through the way things are juxtaposed from the collection. And it tells the story of an empire with some critical language, or some questionable language, visual language, but also the end of the empire is not a good one. So it's interesting that this should be a point of huge popularity.
Yeah, well, I think people are worried these days. People probably are worried globally, but they're particularly worried in the United States, as we were saying before. People, look around them and they're seeing lessons in a work like that really speaks to the obliviousness of populations about what could befall them if they're not careful, if they don't watch out, if they don't think deeply and carefully about what's happening around them. So I think many people just see it as a cautionary tale right now.
Yes.
And it's been a centerpiece for a number of lectures, in fact, and some essays and even books on topics that have nothing to do with Course of Empire or the 19th century, but it's just seen as emblematic that way. The other collections that you mentioned are Audubon birds. It's an interesting story. At the close of the Civil War, Audubon's widow was destitute, and she was forced to sell the entire collection of Audubon's watercolors for preparatory for Birds of America. And there was a race between a British Museum and New York Historical, and we won. We purchased them at a very low price, but as I said, she was destitute. And we have 420 or so absolutely stunning watercolors that are all in our collection. We have a monopoly on the Audubon watercolors and much else. But I would say that our Tiffany lamp collection is probably my favorite. We find ourselves, there's a lot of Tiffany in this building, as a matter of fact, and we've been here as a museum and kind of riffed off the Tiffany glass here and our own Tiffany glass. But the truly interesting story of the Tiffany lamps is that most of them were actually designed by women, though Mr. Tiffany signed all of them himself. Tiffany apparently believed that women were closer to nature and therefore would be better designers. But the story of the Tiffany lamps, once again, ask any question about our collections, and it does go back to history. So There was an opportunity for women to come from other parts of the country and actually get jobs in Mr. Tiffany's studio. And they were very well paid. They lived in, it's a whole story, an amazing story of how women were actually able, and this is around 1900, end of late 1800s, early 1900s. Women actually were able to cycle around the city, enjoy theater, live in co-ed boarding houses, and really have a very, very vibrant kind of life in the city, and work at Tiffany Studios. So I would say that the beauty of the lamps, coupled with the fact that these objects tell very robust stories about life in New York and opportunity, and a segment of the population that honestly had little opportunity at that time, but much through Tiffany, though he signed the lamps himself.
So those collections are all quite historical, but going around the museum, as I was only this morning,
Prepping.
Very prepared. There are a number of displays that are from more recent history, including one dedicated to 9/11, which is a very moving moment in the display. But what was particularly interesting to me is the text, the interpretation around it, spoke about how the curators at the museum actively went out to collect that moment in history as quickly as they could. That seems like a very interesting response to history as it happens, almost a paradoxical one. Are you able to sort of tell us how that came about and the effect it's had?
Yes, absolutely. On September 11th, my predecessor, a great historian of New York, Ken Jackson, was president of the New York Historical Society. And when I tell this story, I always liken him to our founders. He also found himself in the middle of the most turbulent of times. Many people were thinking that there would be further attacks. I was in New York at the time. Everyone was looking at the sky, terrified that something else was going to happen. September 12th, Ken Jackson instructed the entire New York historical curatorial team to go back to work. He said, policemen are going back to work, fire department's going back to work, historians and curators have to go back to work as well, because otherwise we will lose this moment. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will want to know what happened on September 11th. And they won't have any answer at all unless this institution goes out and collects around that day, that terrible day. And so they did. The team, as it existed at the time, was deployed downtown to downtown, and our collection was really built on that incredible sense of history as it was happening. And there's an important lesson in that, because actually history is a lot about agency. If people don't sort of really recognize and have a strong consciousness of their own role in enabling future generations to know what happened on a particular day at a particular moment, then no one will know what happened. It will all be, as our founders said, speculation. That's, conjectures. So, and that really, for our institution, sort of also situated ourselves as a particular kind of institution that would always look henceforth for important moments, always try to say, sometimes they turn out not to be so important, but we don't know that at the time. Occupy Wall Street. Who knows? Maybe it will turn out to be more important than it seems to be right now. But there's a lot going on downtown, and our curatorial team went downtown. We have a fantastic collection around Occupy Wall Street and much else.
Yes. So what's also interesting about this is it relates directly to how people read objects, what an object stands for. And I was interested in the Eli Needleman statues that are on the staircase in the American of the Four Seasons. And they're kind of wonderful 20th century sculptures. They're very beautiful in their own right. They tell a story about an artist who became interested in folk art, but they also tell a story about one of the most impressive female entrepreneurs in the 20th century, Helena Rubinstein. And I was intrigued by which stories you want to pull out about objects, and their many layers, when you're looking at both display and collecting objects.
Well, you're very observant, and I think you'll have to give the tours from now on because these statues are in a very interstitial space at our institution, and unless you're climbing actually from the first floor to the fourth floor, ceilings at our institution are very high, so the staircase is those staircases are very long, steep ones to climb. So congratulations on that as well.
I needed my 10,000 steps.
But indeed. So, another thing that we say constantly about our collections is objects tell stories, and they do. And we have 250,000 students who learn history with us every year, some of them in a week-long residential program, others in field trips, and others who we go out to schools. I mean, there are some very far-flung places of New York, Staten Island, Far Rockaway. I mean, those children are probably, Manhattan is like another world to them. So we send our educators there. And our theory in terms of educating those students is exactly to kind of encourage them, trying to tease out of them what these objects might have been used for. So we have, for example, a lantern in our collection. It's a lantern from New York in the 1700s. And it, looks like a kind of interesting piece. You can pretty much tell it's a lantern. It has grill work on it. It was a lantern that was required to be used, or those were the kinds of lanterns that were required to be used under British colonial rule in New York by enslaved people. It was forbidden. When New York became New York after it was New Amsterdam, when the British took over, and I'm sorry, I don't mean any cast aspersions, but
I did an interview with Kapani Kawanga about this, so I'm used to the slings and arrows being flung at me over this one.
So, indeed, what happened in New York was race became. I mean, under the Dutch, slavery was a condition; it wasn't a fate. I don't want to sugarcoat it in any way, but you could get your freedom. You could get your freedom under the Dutch in New Amsterdam, and it happened with quite regularity. But under the British, race became equated with slavery, with enslavement. So black people in New York, there was just a presumption that every black person in New York was enslaved, and the British established a set of quite draconian rules about how enslaved people would be allowed to go around the city and do whatever they were doing. And carrying this lantern was one example. They must carry this particular lantern. So, that's how we begin to help young people to understand what it would have been like to have been walking around New York in the 1700s, when in fact out of every 5 people in the city would have been enslaved, which is astonishing to most people who think of New York as such a liberal city. It couldn't possibly have this awful history, but it does. So, that lantern tells a whole story. It's interesting because there are other objects in our collections that really tell a story to some people easily and to others not at all easily. We have a boot jack also from the same, a boot scraper, I guess is the way to call it, not boot jack. The streets in New York were very muddy in the 1700s, and when you went inside a house, you would scrape the boot off. To anyone who rides, which tends to be elite people in New York, it's clear what story that object tells. But to most of the children we educate who are from the New York City public schools, the lantern is actually easier to tease out of them what that could have been used for than the boot scraper. Yes. So it tells the story of class right now as well.
So it's interesting you bring up these stories of old Manhattan. I mean, it's not surprising that you do at all, but obviously this year is the 400th anniversary of the Dutch settlement in Manhattan. And I wondered what sort of conversations you had within your organization about that, about how you were going to commemorate it, what you were going to do, and what stories you were and what stories you were not going to tell.
Well, we are, all of us in New York today are really the recipients of some wonderful gifts that the Dutch bequeathed to us when they arrived on our shores in 1624. 1624 is when they arrived, and 1626 is when they proclaimed New Amsterdam. So we have a 2-year window to commemorate and to think about how to tell these stories. So we didn't want to undermine that story, because really what the Dutch brought to us is the city that we enjoy and live in today, commerce. I mean, the Dutch were very focused on commerce, and so too are we in New York today. They were also focused on conscience to a large degree, and when I said slavery under the Dutch was a condition and not a fate, I don't want to argue that that's tolerance, but it was more tolerance than most Europeans had. A higher level of tolerance and sympathy for other people than most Europeans had in the 1600s. But the Dutch were broad-minded, much more broad-minded than other Europeans in many other cases. So, for example, a small group of Jewish people arrived in New York from Recife in Brazil, which had it had been Dutch, and it was taken over by the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, of course, had the Inquisition still going strong. And so Jews had been expelled from Portugal. They were equally expelled from Brazil at that moment. And a group of them somehow landed in New York. It's improbable that they did. Most of them went back to Amsterdam, where they were from originally. But this group of stragglers arrived in New York City. And Peter Stuyvesant, who was governor at the time, said, I don't like Jews, I don't want you here, and you're going to have to go somewhere else. And they actually appealed to their brethren in Amsterdam, where Jewish people were permitted to do, whatever anyone else was permitted. And they won. And they won a lot. And the Dutch did have this idea, if you could make it, if you were making money, it's okay. You could worship any way that you wanted. I mean, not Catholics, they weren't that tolerant, because they were always fighting against the Spaniards, and the Spaniards were Catholics, so there was that problem, but otherwise,
there's always a line.
Yeah, there's always something.
Do you think you will be looking just at that sort of origin story of
Manhattan?
Sorry,
I should go back, right? I should go back. So, I mean, it's impossible these days to tell a single uniform narrative. And of course, when the Dutch arrived, they didn't arrive to an empty landscape. They arrived to a lot of people who were here already. And they were principally the Lenape tribe of indigenous people. And so we have an exhibition, which maybe you saw this morning. I grew up in New York, and I was sort of taught, it's just a myth that New York bought Manhattan. The Dutch bought Manhattan from the Lenape, from the indigenous people, for $24. But indeed, the Dutch believe that they bought Manhattan for 60 guilders, which was translated later on to $24. We have the letter from the Dutch National Archives on view to prove it. And but the Lenape had no understanding of buying and selling land anything like the Dutch. I mean, the land was for everyone to use, and yeah, sure, it's okay, you can use it. It was not it's just one of those cases of extreme cultural misunderstanding. And it was turned out, as we know, to be a very bad bargain, good bargain for the Dutch, terrible bargain for the Lenape. So, we can't tell the story. There's no records of the Lenape going back to the 1600s. So we invited to tell the story contemporary Lenape tribal members to give their view. And their view and the Dutch view are just nothing alike. But we tell both of those stories. And of course, we do have quite a lot of records of enslavement during the Dutch colonial period and how the first people were brought by the Dutch from really from circulating in the Atlantic world. So we decided not to undermine the, what happened that was so positive for so many of us when the Dutch came, by privileging one story over another. So we give the Dutch full credit, but we did feel it was a more complicated narrative that we had to tell.
Yes. So what's also very interesting about this is the way the museum gives voice to things that are frequently overlooked or ignored or hidden. And just to bring it back to art, since we're at an art fair, I was very surprised to walk in and see Keith Haring on the ceiling, to see the little baby drawing on the Bowery subway sign, which is one of my favorite Keith Haring interventions, and also Simone Lee in the sculpture collection. You're not MoMA, you're not a pioneering contemporary art museum, yet it's interesting to me that your collection contains extraordinary works by contemporary artists who actually have taken a while to be adopted by mainstream contemporary art museums. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that came about and how that happened?
Well, we do have a quite robust art collection, museum collection, and we've talked about the Hudson River School collections, but we also have an extraordinary portrait collection of early New Yorkers from the previous century, and much else. And our view is that when you show art to people from the past, it doesn't always speak to them. It doesn't always tell the stories that an art historian would be able to tease out. And that one strategy could be to have these works dialogue with works that are contemporary and facing contemporary issues. So we decided exactly, we're not MoMA. We are not an art museum. We have a very significant art collection, but we are not an art museum, we're a history museum. That we are going to try to have contemporary works help us or help our visitors to understand the history that the older works tell. And also to give a sense that the issues that are raised in the virtually empty landscapes get sort of repopulated by looking at contemporary works, and we have a much better understanding of what of the meaning. So, in fact, we have very, very selectively been acquiring works that we think can do that, can help us to do that, and it is a very selective process, partly because contemporary art is so expensive.
Yes. Especially in this city.
Yes.
And there's one other big part of the collection that is fascinating, which is the Caro archive.
Right.
And it's very unusual to exhibit an archive in this way. So would you mind just, I'm sort of going with everybody knowing who Robert Caro is, and I don't know if that's a fair assumption. So maybe we should quickly sketch in who he is and then talk a little bit about how you're using that archive in the institution.
So Robert Caro is probably the greatest living American biographer. He's he began his career as a biographer. He was an investigative journalist. Began his career as a biographer by writing a massive biography of Robert Moses, who was a master builder of New York, somebody who was never elected but had more power than any elected official. Yeah. And then he went on to write a series of biographies of Lyndon Johnson, which he's on the last volume, and we all hope he finishes.
Fingers crossed.
Right. These are very, very valuable archives, mainly because people really want to know. This is like the 20th century. These are just not biographies of single figures. They're biographies of a whole historical period and a very long one. So Bob Caro, who's a friend, started, making noises that he wanted to give his archive to some institution, and of course we wanted it very, very badly. So we did eventually acquire the archive, and it is a challenge to exhibit paper because, art is beautiful and many people learn visually and appreciate the visual. Do you really want to be, looking at underlined words and crossed out words as a great biographer sort of gets to the end of his book? But indeed, we have magnifying glasses available for people to use, and they are there. Understanding his beautiful writer, and understanding how hard it is to get from the beginning to the beauty of the finished work. And it's been a very enormously successful exhibition. And this archive is already being used by virtually anyone who wants to know the biographies books are massive, but what was behind them? And it's all there, and we're very, very lucky to have it.
So just before I turn to the audience for questions, one sort of final question, which is, what for you is the immediate future for the Society? Where are you guys heading? Part of it's building, and part of it's sensibility, I think.
Yes, so we really understand ourselves to be in the midst of a moment in time when history is more important than ever before. No one trusts media anymore. And what people do trust are museums, particularly history museums. People know that the authentic, it happened. Our 9/11 collection or any of the other collections that we have. These things in our past happened. They really happened. And we're kind of, the antidote to fake news. So we see ourselves as the guardians of an important set of moments in the past that must be not only preserved as our founders thought, but also disseminated. So we see ourselves as reaching the broadest population possible. We also see ourselves as an institution that tells the story of struggle. The American experiment was an experiment. Could democracy work? And we see ourselves today as the guardian of that seed, that germ of an idea that democracy might be able to prevail. And everybody knows that, 1776, many, many people in the young United States were not included in that democracy. But we've made progress, and no matter how dim people's views are of American democracy, we have made a lot of progress, and we should all appreciate that, and it should be precious to us. So as an institution going forward, we see ourselves as trying to embrace everyone's story of struggle to perfect the American experiment for themselves, for their own groups, and for every single one of us as Americans. And so that has really motivated us, that and the need to be a good steward for our collection has really motivated us to do a major building project, which hopefully will conclude in 2026, which is a new wing. We were very fortunate for forebears to have had the foresight to buy up some land on the Upper West Side adjacent to our building, and it will occupy a 10,000 square foot previously vacant lot since 1937. It's always been there waiting, and Robert Stern, the architect, has lusted after this project since I set foot in my job now almost 20 years ago, and he got it, and he's designed actually a building that from the outside will look exactly like the building we are currently in, so it would be one seamless building, but the interior is quite extraordinary and beautiful and open and airy. And the top floor of that new wing will be occupied by the American LGBTQ plus museum, the first ever home for a museum that's been theoretical for the last decade. So we're very, very proud of the fact that we've both physically and intellectually been able to say, look, everyone who comes to this institution should learn something from their visit. And they should also be able to see themselves somewhere in the institution.
Perfect. That feels like the perfect place for us to pause. Could I thank you, Louise Mirra, very much for taking part in this conversation. It's been riveting.
Thank you.
Thank you.